So let's get into post-completion OPT. What is post-completion OPT? It's an optional employment opportunity given to F1 students where they can work for a maximum of 12 months. Now, the goal of post-completion OPT is to help F1 students enhance the knowledge that they have acquired from their degree programs. This post-completion OPT authorization will be granted by a U.S. government agency called USCIS. Now, when you start the process of requesting this authorization, you will start with your International Student Office, who makes a recommendation to the U.S. government to grant you your post-completion OPT. The post-completion OPT, is important to note, is not its own visa. So, although you're no longer in school, while you are on a post-completion OPT, you're still considered to be in an active F1 status, which means that the US visa that applies to your status is going to be the F1 visa. It's also important to know one of the advantages of post-completion optional practical training, which is that it can open doors to a long-term US working visa. So as a personal example, when I finished my degree, I pursued post-completion OPT, and eventually I transitioned from the post-completion OPT to a US green card, which then allows me to work and live in the US long-term. Another cool thing of the post-completion OPT is that it's the only authorization that's given to F1 students that allows you to start and operate a business in the US. So how do you become eligible for post-completion OPT? Well, you got to be maintaining your F1 status, so no previous violations on your record and no criminal records for sure. And when it comes to the program completion requirements you have to meet, you can apply for post-completion OPT only when you get to your last semester in an active F1 status. However, there are some exceptions for PhD students where you can apply for post-completion OPT as early as the completion of your PhD coursework. So what are the job requirements you have to satisfy for post-completion OPT? Just like pre-completion OPT, the job you're going to pursue on post-completion OPT or the business you intend to engage in on post-completion OPT must be directly related to your major. However, at the time you're pursuing post-completion OPT or applying for post-completion OPT, you need not have a job offer. So just like we've done with other work authorizations, let's now get into a conversation on some of the limitations of post-completion OPT that you need to know. The first limitation is the restrictions placed on your capacity to work. Now, this is going to look different from other forms of authorization before graduation, where you were capped to working, let's say, 20 hours a week at the maximum while school is in session. With post-completion OPT, you're done with school, so that is no longer a problem. However, when it comes to part-time work, part-time is defined as anything that's at 20 hours a week, and full-time is going to be defined as anything that's 40 hours a week. So with post-completion OPT, while there's no restriction on the high end, there's a restriction on the low end as to the amount of hours that you can work. What the US government is trying to do is make sure that students who are on post-completion OPT are not just sitting at home idle. They want to make sure that you're getting the most out of the post-completion OPT authorization by being active in the workplace. Another limitation to your capacity to work is that you cannot work on post-completion OPT for more than 12 months. Another limitation of the post-completion OPT are the restrictions you have on unemployment. So like you heard me say before, when it comes to post-completion OPT, the US government agency that grants you this authorization wants you to be fully engaged in the workforce. So they don't want you laying idle at home for the duration of 12 months when you're done with school. They want you to be engaged in the workforce, enhancing that knowledge you've acquired in your education. So that's why they place what's called a restriction on the number of days you can stay unemployed, and that restriction is capped at 90 days. So once you exceed 90 days of being unemployed on post-completion OPT, you're going to be violating your F1 status as an international student. So how exactly that countdown clock will begin is going to be varying from one case to another. But essentially, every time you apply to the US government agency for post-completion OPT authorization, or even the pre-completion OPT authorization, you're going to be asking them to grant you this card. That's about the same size as a driver's license, and it's called the Employment Authorization Document Card. Now, this card has what's called a start date, and that start date is what you're going to tell the U.S. government that you plan to start working on post-completion OPT on that date. And your countdown clock for unemployment will only begin whenever you, number one, receive this card in the mail, and number two, the date on that card has been reached. And from that point on in the future, you cannot accrue more than 90 days of unemployment. Some other limitations of the post-completion OPT have to do with the complex application process. Now, this is something you've already heard me talk about in the case of the pre-completion OPT, where because you're dealing with a U.S. government agency, things just tend to move very slowly. And as a byproduct, it's quite frustrating. There's also going to be another challenge of the significant expenses that you will accrue when applying for post-completion OPT with the U.S. government. So that's just something you're going to have to prepare for, knowing in advance that if you're applying for post-completion OPT, you're going to be spending anywhere between $500 to about $2,000.